In this video we are going to learn about users and groups on Linux. And before we begin the actual video, I just want to mention that all the code and the presentations that you see in my videos are uploaded on my GitHub page, for which you can get the link from the description of each video. Also, if you enjoy the video, if you find it useful or if it helps you, please like it, maybe also share it. And if you want to subscribe, you will be notified when I post new videos. Linux users and groups. First, let's get it out of the way. When we are talking about users and groups on Linux, we are talking about local users and local groups. So each system with its own user. Even though maybe the name is the same, the actual user is different. This is the same as on Windows with local users and groups. In Linux, if you want to see a list of all your local users, you can check out the password file or passwd, which is located in the etc directory. Here you will find the lines. Each line contains the data for one user. The actual passwords for the user will not actually be found in this file, but the hashes for the passwords are found in a different file called shadow. And if you want to also see a list of groups on a specific system, you can check out the group file. And regarding the shadow file, the reason why the password hash is separate from the file with the other info about the users is because the shadow file can only be read by the root user, which is the equivalent of the Windows local administrator basically. Users in Linux can be members of one or more groups, and from what I know, groups cannot be members of other groups, so users are put in groups and that's it. Every user must be a member of a primary group, and actually every user is a member of a primary group because it's done by default. When you create a user, a group with the user's name will also be created, and that user is part of that group. Besides the primary group, users can also be members of 0 or more secondary groups. And secondary groups are just groups that the user is added to after it has been created. The importance of the primary group is that when a specific user creates a file or a directory, then that primary group is set on the created item. In Linux, as also in Windows, users and groups are referenced for us by name because it's easier for us to understand, but in actuality the operating system identifies these objects using IDs. For users we have the UID, and for groups we have the GID. And since the operating system actually uses these IDs in the background, of course the mapping for users and groups, which user belongs to which group, is also done using these IDs. The Ubuntu operating system reserves all IDs, group and user IDs, between 1 and 999. So if you want to create users and groups and set your own IDs, then you should use a number starting with 1000. Next, let me show you how a password file is structured. So each line in this file creates the data for one specific user. I took one example here, so let's start. The first part of the file, as you see highlighted here, is the actual username. Then the second part, that X, means that the encrypted password for this user is stored in the shadow file. Then we have the user ID. Then we have the primary group ID for this user. Next is the comment or the description for this user. This can contain spaces, and it's a field that can help you more easily identify what this user is for. So basically this is a description. Next is the user's home directory path. And the last item is the shell that the user uses by default. So when CentOS 100 logs on to a Linux system, it will use the bash shell. So next, let's see a couple of commands that you can use to manage users and groups on Linux. First, let me show you the free files that contain the data about groups and users on Linux. First, the password file. So let's get the contents of this file now, and here they are. And you see you have multiple lines, each line with its own user, like for example this one. Exactly like we saw in the slides earlier. Next is the shadow file, and for this file we have to add the sudo command in front of the cat command. Actually, we'll see later in this video why we need this. And we need to enter a user 100's password. And you see the shadow command looks a little different. It has the username and then it has an encrypted password in this file. And the last file I want to show you is the group file, which contains a list of all the local groups. And here they are. This is a little more simple because groups are actually a little more simple. Now let's get to the good stuff and actually create ourselves a user. And this is the command to do it. We use user add. -m is specified if we want the user to also have a home directory and that home directory to be created. And we set the default shell to bash and the user will be called user 101. And it has been created, but we still have something to do. We need to set also a password for this user. And this is the command that we use to do it. And now the user has been created, the password set, so it's ready to be used. Let's see where the user is stored. So let's search in the password file for user 101, and here it is with all of its information. And let's also search for the group, because as you remember, when we create the user, it also creates the primary group, and here it is. Now let me also show you how to create your own groups. In this example, we create the group called G1 and I manually set its group ID to 5000. And the group add command is what you use to do it. And now it should be created. And with the group created, let's also add our newly created user to the group. And this is done with the user mod command. We add it to G1 and the user is user 101. And that's it. Now with the user part already of two groups, the primary group and one secondary group, let me show you two commands with which you can see a user's groups. First is the groups command, and if you don't specify a username, it will show you the data for your current user, but we want to see for user 101. And you see it's part of its primary group and the G1 group. And you can also use the ID command. And the output of this command is a little less friendly, but still you get the same information. Now we have one more thing to talk about, and that is the root user. As I mentioned earlier, in Linux the root user is a cross between the Windows local administrator and the Windows system user. One thing to mention about the root user on Ubuntu is that you cannot log in interactively with it. The only way that you can harness the power of the root user on Ubuntu is using the sudo command. And this actually brings us to the sudo command. This command is used so you can run commands as the root user, or if you want to, as another user. The way you use it is you just place the sudo word in front of any command you want to run, and it will be run as the root user if you don't specify any other parameters. With sudo, you can also open an interactive shell for the root user. Even though root cannot log on interactively, it can open an interactive shell using sudo. And last but not least, an important info that you should know is that if you want to grant a normal user rights to use sudo, you just have to add him to the sudo group. And that's it. Let's see a couple of examples of how we use sudo. So first, let me show you who is in the sudo group. So if you remember, we use grep to find a specific word, in our example sudo, in a specific file. And as you can see, part of the sudo group is only user 100, and this is perfect because we are logged on as user 100. So first let me show you how to open an interactive session with the root user using sudo. You just run sudo -i, and as you can see the prompt changed and I'm now as the root user. And if you don't trust me, we will use the whoami command, and you see that we are root. So we can do now whatever we want without using sudo in front because we are already as the root user. Use exit to go back to your previous shell. And let me also show you how to open an interactive session as another user. You also specify -u and the username. And now we are with a shell that is run by user 101. And that's also it for the interactive part. You already saw a lot of examples of how to use sudo with normal commands. There's no use in showing you more, but actually you will see more in the next two commands because I also want to show you how to delete a user and delete a group. First, let's use userdel to delete user 101. Group del is used to delete a specific group, in our case G1. And with this, we are done with this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This was it for users and groups on Linux. Subscribe if you want to be notified when I put out new videos, and thanks a lot for watching.